Hello, welcome to Unit 3. This unit is about the early Renaissance in Italy. I just wanted to say thank you for introducing yourself to me by email. If you haven't done so by now, please do so. I'm looking forward to working with you. We have a really great class this semester. A lot of you have some art in your background already, and you have some great exposure to the art that you were learning about. I found it interesting that some of you are actually studying in Florence right now. Okay, so before we get going and talking about art from the early Renaissance, let's talk about the city of Florence. Let's talk about how the political climate is going in Italy. So if we think about Italy today, Italy is structured into one country with several cities. But in 1400, it wasn't divided that way. It was divided up into city-states. A city-state basically was its own little country. It had its very own government, and it had the ability to make decisions independent from Italy as a whole. Now, there were other city-states too. We've talked about some of them. Siena was one of those city-states. And others that you might know just from Italy being a famous place. Milan, Venice, Genoa, Sicily, Naples, all of those areas were their own city-state as well. They were a democracy, but not a democracy in the sense that we think of today. We think of a democratic republic as a republic that elects officials that go to bat for the local people's ideas and voices, right? Like we elect somebody who will represent us in our government. Italy wasn't like that at this point. Florence was ruled by several very powerful families, primarily the Strazzis and the Medicis. We'll talk about one more family when we get to the Foundling Hospital, though. So typically, what would happen is that the more powerful families were ruled by bankers and merchants. Those powerful families were the ones who were able to go to the courts and have a voice in the courts, because the ruling elite knew that they were dependent on the financial success of the upper class merchants. And so because of that, the upper class merchants have a lot more say in what goes on within the city-state. However, with having that amount of responsibility and the amount of say, there's also a greater risk. If for some reason the government doesn't like what the merchants are doing, they can just run the merchant out of town, which is something that we're going to see happen here in a little bit. Ruling elite. The political power really relied on the hands of the merchants, the wealthy families that controlled trade, controlled product, controlled the guilds. And so in this case, the wealthy families were the Medicis and the Strazzis. Florence really was an extraordinarily wealthy country or city-state. And there was really a growing distance between the upper class of merchants and bankers and the lower class everyday people that worked. When a society accumulates a lot of wealth, there becomes a humanistic desire to enjoy the finer things in life. And so, because life here on earth is a life of luxury or a life of comfort, it tends to be a situation where people don't look to the afterlife as much, and they're not as focused on their religion and faith. The Florentine are really proud people. They're people that, like, even if you go there today, they're just really proud of their cathedral. They have a lot of civic pride. And it doesn't really matter what their station in life is. They just really love their country, um, or their city-state. At this time, the Republic, though, is really controlled by the Medicis and the Strazzis. But based on the social structure at this time, humanism is just something that really is thriving in Florence. So typically, this is the time in art history that most students really enjoy art history too. They have heard of this group of artists called the Raphaelites. That's Leonardo and Michelangelo and Raphael and Donatello. Yeah, those are the main ones. But in order to get to those people, we have to start with a few other superstars that came right before them. So this is the early Renaissance. We're not quite to the high Renaissance yet, but we're going to kind of walk into it. I think the other thing that most people have heard of the Raphaelites are because we have pop icons that were made to honor the Raphaelites. For example, the one I show you here, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. All right, so I said in order to learn about the Raphaelites, we have to learn about the few geniuses that came before them. Genius number one was Ghiberti, and genius number two is Brunelleschi. So in 1416, Florence decides they're going to hold a competition. They're holding a competition to see what artist is talented enough to design the dome for the Florence Cathedral. And so they decide that whoever wins this competition for the baptistry doors will win the commission of the dome for the cathedral. And so the Linen Guild sponsors the competition, and they decide that they're going to dictate a few things about the entry. So number one, it had to be made of bronze. It also had to depict the biblical story of the sacrifice of Isaac. And the panel had to be formatted in this quatrefoil shape. So I happen to mention the guild. What's a guild? The guild was a collection of businesses that dealt with a particular trade that they had in common. So for example, the Linen Guild would have had business members that owned yarn companies and dye companies and weaving companies to produce linen. Together, they would band together and order their supplies for their business so that they got a better wholesale price and so that they had better wholesale buying power. So for example, let's say I own a yarn company and I want to make blue yarn. I need to buy blue dye to make the yarn, but when I buy blue dye, the only bottle I can buy is a 50-ounce bottle. And so the linen guy, he wants to dye all of his woven linen that's white blue. And so he and I team up together, and we buy a 50-ounce bottle, and he uses the other 40 ounces. Or sometimes the guild itself will buy the bottle, and I can go and buy 10 ounces from the guild instead of having to buy the big huge bottle. And that way we can share resources. All right, so let's go back to that contest. This was Brunelleschi's entry. Many artists entered the contest, and Ghiberti and Brunelleschi were really the front runners for the competition. When the judges met to decide the winner, they decided they were going to interview both leaders of the competition because they really were having a hard time deciding. And no one could really come up with a way to construct the dome. They just knew that they wanted to take on the challenge. And so Brunelleschi comes up with an additional challenge. He says anybody that can stand an egg on its end should be the one that gets the commission for the doors. And so he shows them that you could stand an egg on one end by smashing one end so that the egg lays flat. The judges liked Ghiberti's relief panel the best, but they felt that Brunelleschi really had a point. And so the commission for the dome is awarded to Ghiberti and Brunelleschi. However, Ghiberti was not happy about having to work with Brunelleschi. In fact, he was so mad about it that he pretended to be sick to get out of working with him. So Brunelleschi goes on to design the dome and take full credit for the engineering. But wait, I said that the contest was to design the door panels, right? Well, let's go back to that in a minute. But first, let's talk about Brunelleschi and how he made the dome work. We really still don't know how he built the dome completely, but we do have some ideas to the solutions that he came up to create a dome that didn't fall in on itself and that didn't sink. So the dome needs to be lightweight. If it's not lightweight, it'll crush itself. And so he makes this thing called an ogival dome. An ogival dome is basically a dome that's in the shape of an egg. He uses this ogival shape to spread the weight of the dome across a major pier system. And the piers actually support the weight of the structure. He gives the dome ribs. The ribs keep the dome from collapsing in on itself. And he makes a hollow double-shelled dome. So one shell inside of the other. This creates a dome with a big, huge air gap in it, which actually allows the workers to live inside the dome. He builds a pulley system that helps the workers to have access to their materials. And then he consolidates most of the mass of the dome between the ribs. So Brunelleschi also lays the brick for the exterior of the dome in a herringbone pattern. So instead of them being laying horizontally, he lays them in a V shape. And then he attaches a lantern to the top of the dome. That lantern is weighty enough that it helps to hold the structure tightly together. When it's completed, the Florentines are proud of their dome. And if you go there today, you will see that they are still very proud of the dome and their cathedral. So let's go back to that contest for a minute. You know that the contest created this lifelong rivalry between Ghiberti and Brunelleschi. But I didn't really tell you who got the commission for the set of doors. It was Ghiberti who won the commission for the baptistry doors. Here, if you study the two works of art closely, you can contrast and compare them. So here's a homework question. I'm asking you to be the judge. Tell me who you think should have won the contest and why. Be descriptive. What did the artist do artistically that made you feel like he did a better job? All right, so let's go back to why Ghiberti won the contest over Brunelleschi for the doors. Brunelleschi's biographer says that it was a tie and that he withdrew from the competition. But not all of our history records agree. Most say that the judges chose Ghiberti to design the baptistry doors. Some art historians have a theory, though, that it all has to do with this guy right here. His name is the Duke of Milan. And he decides that he's going to invade Florence in 1402. He's on his way to Florence from Siena, and he's headed to take over Florence, and military intelligence from Florence receives word that he's taken over Siena and that he's on his way to them. And they're able to head off the attack because the Duke of Milan's troops retreat. Why? Because he dies of the plague. They get scared and they're like, oh, we're not going to beat Florence now, so we're just going to go back home. The Florentine citizens really interpreted this military retreat as a sign that God favored them and protected them. They imagined themselves as the new Rome, the group of people that was going to go back to the ancient Roman Republic and to sort of revive the classical ideals and classical traditions of ancient Rome. They thought they were the heirs to the ancient Roman Republic. And they also were prepared to sacrifice for that cause. And so Ghiberti depicts the angel swooping in to intersect the destruction of Isaac. You can see the angel right there. Here, I'll draw it out for you. You can see him right here. He's swooping in with his arm here stretched out to stop Isaac in mid-action. And the people of Florence felt that Ghiberti's panel represented that tension of swooping down to save Isaac. Other historians feel that Brunelleschi's piece was just too progressive for the early Renaissance. Brunelleschi really abandons the old Gothic style completely. Ghiberti adds some new things, but he really keeps a lot of the Gothic characteristics that are the hallmarks of the Gothic era. Whereas Brunelleschi sort of spreads out his subjects to use the entire panel space. And he creates a bit of a sense of depth and a more humanistic look to the figures. So you study the two panels and see whether or not you agree with the judges. Here's your contrast and compare essay. You're either going to do the question that we just talked about, you be the judge, or you're going to write an answer to this homework question. All right, so now that we've gotten through the panel contest, or the contest with the doors of the baptistry, let's talk about Brunelleschi and what he did in terms of architecture in Florence. So in 1421, Brunelleschi is winning lots of architectural commissions, and he wins the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence. He designs the church completely from scratch, and he wants to build a church that's focused around humanism and the conception of God being an entity that's here on earth, accessible to all the humans that are in worship. He wants to abandon the idea of the church trying to reach heaven. In the Gothic era, there was this push for all the churches to be very, very tall, because they thought the taller they made the church, the closer they got to heaven with their prayers. And the closer they are to heaven, the more likely God was to bless them. And so this church is the complete opposite of that. Brunelleschi makes the ceiling very low so that the building doesn't seem otherworldly and as if there was a bunch of empty airspace, and that God was so far up into the heavens that the humans could not access him. He also puts the altar right in front of the apse, so that when you walk into the nave, the altar is highlighted at the end of the nave. There's really no frilliness here. He sort of gets rid of that typical Gothic, lacy looking frilliness that we associate with the Gothic. And he opens the nave up. The ceiling is lower, I talked about that, and the colonnade really enforces the idea that the altar is at the center and the focus of the worship is on the Eucharist. He likes the square. He is trying really hard to revive the Roman Republic building techniques. So those colonnades are a common Roman building technique. And the square is the representation of mathematical proportion that the Greeks really focused on in the classical era. And so, the Greeks built the Parthenon with the idea of a 2-to-1 ratio is the perfect formula for nature. And so Brunelleschi wants to capitalize on that and make his church a church that has a formula that represents nature and God here on earth. And so he uses that 2-to-1 ratio. If you look here, you can see the square being repeated over and over again. So the main patron of Florence is this guy. He's really rich and he invests in the city of Florence. He has great power, a lot of money, but he also causes a lot of turmoil. His name is Cosimo de' Medici. And at the end of the early Renaissance, the Florentines decide they're going to kick him out and his family, and he goes to live in exile for quite some time. So the Medicis originally reject Brunelleschi's plan. They want to build a palace, and they think that his plan's way too elaborate. Right now, there's a law in Florence that keeps wealthy people from making a public display of their money and wealth. And so Cosimo knows that things are tense and that he might get run out of town if he flaunts his wealth. And so he decides that he's going to have Bartolomeo design his palace instead. The Medici's house was more than just their house. They do business from this house. And so the shops in the lower level of the house is where the family would have done business, and then they would have lived above the shops. So the shops are all on the first floor, and you can see how rough the bricks are. They have a lot more texture to them on the ground level. The center seems to be a little bit smoother and more refined brick, and the top is so refined that you can't really tell the distinction between each individual brick. This is a humanism concept. It is the idea that as the human reaches an upper level in their life, that they become more smooth and polished and more in favor with God. Here's the interior of the Palazzo de' Medici. You can go there today. Last time I was in Florence, I was there. It was a really beautiful place. They have lots of statuary, and the inside has beautiful sculptures, and it's just really a lovely interior. And of course, they go back to reviving those traditional Roman Republic ideals with the repeating barrel vaulting, and the groin vaulting in the interior of the colonnades. Traditionally, architecture in Italy has a courtyard. And so he sort of finishes this space in that traditional Italian way with the courtyard. The rooms that you see added to like the courtyard are done in squares. They're attached symmetrically. And the building seems to have an enclosed second story. The Medici coat of arms can be seen from the interior. And of course the grand sculpture collection that I just mentioned. The Medicis were very wealthy and they commissioned lots of art, and so this was part of where they kept the art. But Brunelleschi, before they finish the palace, wins a commission for an orphanage. It's called the Foundling Hospital, and it's accessible to the public. And it was funded by the silk manufacturers and the goldsmiths guild. It was located near the church of Santissima. Well, we'll just say the Most Holy Annunciation. The church has an impressive painting in it, and it was so popular as a pilgrimage site. The building paid homage to traditional Roman forms, which we're definitely seeing here. You can see the repeating colonnade and the repeating barrel vaulting. They use the Pythagorean theorem here, the 2-to-1 ratio, just like they did in the palace, or in the Church of San Lorenzo. And Brunelleschi really uses his training as a goldsmith and a sculptor to help him design something that's really aesthetically pleasing, and that incorporates the elements of humanism that he wanted to incorporate, like he did in the Church of San Lorenzo. These relief sculptures of infants were added in 1487. They were added in between the spandrels of the arcade, and they seemed appropriate given the building's function of the Foundling Hospital. The building does deal with humanism ideas, but the infants seem to kind of float in the medallions. The light blue color is a signature color that was owned by the Robbia family. And so the Robbia family would have been the family that put up the money for the Foundling Hospital. Kind of like Tiffany's is famous for this blue. We automatically think of their company, and so the Foundling Hospital's backgrounds where the infants sort of float in that blue circle is a signature of the Robbia families. The infants were commissioned to remind the city that the most wealthy guild, the one that built the hospital, was caring for the most innocent and helpless of Florentine citizens, the foundlings. And so, additionally, they want to show that they supported the lower class citizens, because there was a lot of harsh power and politics that were going on in Florence during this early Renaissance time. We see that the Robbia family has an increased sense of social responsibility. This is the exterior of Or Saint-Michel. You can see the blue arrow is pointing to the niche, that recessed space in the facade of the building. If you go all the way around the church, you can see that it has niches all the way around, which provides opportunity for sculpture. Typically, one of the guilds would sponsor the niche and pay for a sculpture to be created for the niche of the building. It was free advertising for the guild. Well, I guess not free because they paid for it, but it was basically ancient advertising. This one was sponsored by the Woodcarvers and Stone Guild. It is called the Four Crown Saints, or here they call it the Four Crown Martyrs. They were basically people who were executed for not being willing to create sculptures and antiquity of the Roman gods. The Emperor Diocletian executed them because they were Christian and didn't want to worship the Roman gods. The Four Crown Saints introduces an ideal system in the world of sculpture. It's a throwback to ancient Roman forms to describe the body and the face. It's important because this style hasn't been looked at since antiquity. Because of Florentine civic pride and the new ideas of humanism, it's causing artists to represent the figure in a way that the Romans did, with a more naturalistic, realistic point of view. Uh, the saints define a new spatial relationship between the building and the viewer, and they stand in a semicircle. But their feet and the garments hang on to the floor and interrupt the space. It makes it more relatable to the sculpture because it extends into the viewer's space. This is another one of the niches at Or Saint-Michel. This is Donatello's St. George. It's now in a museum, but when it was commissioned, it was for one of the niches. It was sponsored by the Arms and Metalsmith Guilds. You can see that, the Armors and Swordmakers Guild. You can see that this influences Donatello's choice in how to depict the saint. He depicts him as a warrior who would have used a lot of those metal smithing tools and the swords and the armor. Donatello uses long straight lines to accentuate the proud look of St. George. The large shield that you see creates that long line that makes Donatello's St. George seem extraordinarily tall and proud and upright. And this is another of Donatello's statues that came from the niche at Or Saint-Michel. It is the first representation of contrapposto since antiquity. So what's contrapposto? Contrapposto is basically the natural way a human being stands. So typically that weight is shifted from one hip to another, and then one knee relaxed and one leg carries all of the weight of the person who's standing on it. So we get this nice tilt of the hips and in turn a nice tilt of the shoulders. Donatello is really trying to add some versatility from his statues. He's done a lot of the statues for Or Saint-Michel, and so he doesn't want them to become stagnant. And so this new representation of how the figure stands is a way for him to vary what he's representing in statuary. This particular sculpture was commissioned by the Linen Guild. So take a minute and look and see what elements of the statue advertise for the Linen Guild. Basically, the Linen Guild rejects the statue. They don't feel that the head is proportionate to the rest of the body. And it was shown at street level instead of high up in the niche. And so, of course, Donatello made the head a little bit bigger. Without the head being a little bit bigger, you would not have been able to see the details of the face from the ground floor. This technique that he's using is an offset for what we call foreshortening. Foreshortening is the shortened or the exaggeration of space, the exaggeration of the object being close to you in space. We'll keep looking at foreshortening. It's easier to see on a two-dimensional painting. So according to The Lives of Artists by the art historian Vasari, Donatello tells the Linen Guild that he'll fix the statue, but then he places it in the niche, and he didn't fix it. He says he's going to modify it again after he puts it in the niche. He covers it up and then, sure enough, uncovers it, and everyone thinks that he's done something spectacular to it, when in all actuality, he just left it the way he had sculpted it in the beginning. All right, so I want you to take a second and look up contrapposto. Look it up in your book. Look it up on the interwebs, and get a really good idea of what contrapposto is. We will look at many examples of contrapposto in this semester. This is another sculpture by Donatello. It's Donatello's David. It was commissioned by the Medici family for their private sculpture gallery. So we should talk a little bit about private art versus public art. Private art is art that is really meant just for the family. It wouldn't be looked at by large masses of people. It would be something that was just for the family's home, something that only the family and close personal friends and guests of the family would see in the Medici's house. So Donatello's David was one of the most important works of art in the history of art for the early Renaissance era. It was important because it uses and popularizes the technology of the lost wax process, but it also was a return of the nude sculpture to a technique called sculpture in the round. Sculpture in the round is a technique that states that the sculpture can be viewed from any vantage point in a 360-degree circle. So no matter what point you look at the sculpture, you're still looking at a beautiful work of art that doesn't really have a front or a back. This hasn't been done since antiquity, and so this is really the big deal around Donatello's David. Here I have included a video that tells you a little bit about the lost wax process. Please play it and get a good understanding of what the lost wax process is. The lost wax process is something very important because it tends to be a measure of sophistication within a culture. So what happens is that once the lost wax process has been invented, which it was invented in ancient civilizations, even the ancient Sumerians, going back to 3000 BCE, were able to do the lost wax process. Now, they didn't have the exact same tools that we have today, so obviously silicone was not invented in that time. And I don't exactly know what they used in terms of substituting for the silicone, but this will give you a good idea of what the lost wax process is and how it's used to create art. So I told you that Donatello's David was commissioned by the Medici family for their private courtyard and sculpture garden within their palace. The sculpture would have been viewed from high above, so it would have sat on a pedestal where the viewer looked from the ground up at the pedestal, unlike how we look at it here, which is a head view straight on. You can see that Donatello chooses to represent David as a young boy. That representation caused a lot of controversy in the history of art and in the Medici's time. But let's talk more about what Donatello could have meant by sculpting David as a young man. David is presented without muscles. He's presented to you as nothing but a young boy that God used to fight the Philistines. Why is this an important point? Well, because most statues of David are presented as David being an older man who is very muscular and king-like. And so because of this, some art historians believe that Donatello was choosing to represent David in a more humanistic manner. Humanistic meaning that we as people all age. If he had depicted David as a king, then it's possible that people would have likened him to a god or goddess. And so that practice of depicting kings in the Gothic era, David or Donatello decided that he was going to put a new spin on and create a work of art that had a unique point of view. In addition to the fact that he sculpts David as a young man, some art historians believe that Donatello is implying that the victory that David had was not a victory of David's, it was a victory of God's. That a young boy this age could not have possibly fought a giant and won because he's not strong enough. God had to have been on his side. You see the moment after David has taken the giant down and he's sort of standing in his victory lap. He's got his foot on top of Goliath's head with his sword down at his side that he's used to sever Goliath's head. And he just stands there contemplating the success that he's had. Here I've given you a close-up of the face that Donatello sculpts of David's. It's accepted that his body is very young boy looking, but I ask you a question about his face here. Do you feel like this is the face of a young boy? I would tend to disagree that this is not the face of a young boy. It's the face of probably a 14 or 15-year-old. So young boy just depends on how you want to look at how you define young, but certainly not a child. We see David wear a hat with laurel leaves around the top of the hat and boots with a feather that runs up the inside of his thigh. The face is a face of a young boy who has definitely gone or is going through puberty. This point about the face is an important one because some art historians feel that this particular sculpture was very homoerotic. It was very common in the Renaissance time for an older gentleman to have a young man as a lover, and we tend to focus on this particular work in the LGBTQ community. Here you can see the point about the homoerotic sculpture more so with the feather that runs up the inside of David's thigh. The feather is from Goliath's helmet, but it runs up the inside of David's thigh, and David, of course, stands in contrapposto. You can see how his weight is shifted onto the one leg, and the other leg is relaxed, and his hips are at a tilted angle. So just a little background about the story of David and Goliath. Goliath was a giant. He was a large man from the Philistines. I'm telling you a little bit about the biblical story. So he was a Philistine. He was a very large man, and David was just a boy. Here is Goliath's head. You can see that he is a mature man and a larger one based on his maturity. David stands on Goliath's head in a victory pose. The story of David and Goliath actually goes that David shot him with a slingshot, and that David was very tiny compared to Goliath being very large and giant-like. Goliath had terrorized the people, the Christian group of people that David was protecting, and the Philistines were very rough and gruff people. This is another really important work of Donatello's. It's the equestrian statue of Erasmo Narni. It is a 12-foot tall bronze statue, so it was cast using the lost wax process, and it was commissioned by the Republic of Venice. Their goal was to produce a commemorative piece to a recently deceased condottiere. Condottiere is a Roman police officer. This is the first equestrian statue to rival the Roman imperial portraits. And so because of that, we call this time a classical revival. It's a classical revival because in the Roman Empire, a lot of times they would build these large churches, or well, large civic buildings with temples and libraries and buildings that were services to the people that lived around them. And in the middle of the temple area, there was a courtyard. And in the courtyard, there would be a large column, and on top of it would be one of these equestrian statues. And so Donatello decides that he's going to revive the classical ideals of the equestrian statues. You can see here the condottiere's horse has its paw or foot hoof on top of the small ball. It's at a standstill, but you can get a sense of motion because the horse has a tail that is standing in a more upright position as if he's stopped just for a moment in time. During the classical revival, we see a resurgence of portraiture. Take a moment and think about why portraiture would have been a hallmark of the rise of individualism. So let's check in on Brunelleschi while Donatello's sculpting in Florence and Ghiberti's getting more and more commissions for baptistry doors. Brunelleschi decides that he's going to go to Athens, to Greece, and to Rome to see all of the classical architecture. And while he's there, he's trying to draw all of the buildings. And he realizes that in nature, to make the drawing look correct in terms of foreshortening, he needs a tool. And so while he's there, he invents one-point perspective. You can see here how he's got a viewing instrument with a hole in it that helps him to invent one-point perspective. One-point perspective utilizes a horizon line and a single vanishing point, and objects appear smaller as they get closer together as they recede into space. Grounded objects that are closer to the viewer appear larger. So I mentioned that Ghiberti is designing doors. He gets more commissions for doors. After he finishes the doors for the Florence Cathedral, he goes to work on baptistry doors for the baptistry of San Giovanni in Florence. You can see that they are large single cast bronze doors, and he utilizes the new one-point perspective that Brunelleschi has invented to create some of the panels. The panels that sit right at the viewer's eye level are the ones that he utilized the perspective. One-point perspective is very specific in that you have to be able to lay a piece of paper over top of the work and draw with a ruler lines that all go to a single vanishing point. And he does this in some of the panels that he creates. One-point perspective is unique because it draws your eye into the panel through a set of what we call orthogonals and transversals. they are lines that go to that one point vanishing point. And when we get to the next slide, I'll show you that a little bit more clearly. Ghiberti makes some changes when he does these doors. For one thing, he chooses to sculpt figures that retain the sense of perspective in all of the panels. And he sculpts the figure with these graceful lines and forms that are more classical. They recall the works of art from ancient Rome and ancient Greece. He also gets rid of that quatrefoil shape that was dictated by the Florence baptistry and uses the square to describe the panel. Remember that square is looked at as being more perfect in nature because it's a mathematically proportional system. This is Ghiberti's Jacob and Esau panel from the Gates of Paradise. This particular panel is right at eye level, and Ghiberti utilizes one-point perspective to tell the story of Jacob and Esau. The vanishing point is in the center of the plate, and you can take a ruler and draw a straight line for all the lines that are perfectly straight at the single vanishing point in the center of the plate. Now remember I said that Brunelleschi was the one that invented one-point perspective, but Ghiberti decides that he's going to utilize the knowledge that Brunelleschi has gained. The story is the story of Jacob and Esau. I don't know the story of Jacob and Esau that well, but I do know that basically Rebecca likes one of the brothers more than the other, and so she tells the brother that she favors to go get a calf and to kneel before the father who is blind, and to give the calf to the father, and then the father will appoint the son that tricked him to the inheritor of the estate of Esau, or the estate of Jacob, I'm sorry. And so basically they trick the old man into giving the son who was younger the estate because Rebecca favored one son over the other. Another early Northern Renaissance superstar is Masaccio. Giorgio Vasari was one of the very first art historians, and he wrote about Masaccio that everything done before him can be described as artificial, whereas he produces work that is living, realistic, and natural. Masaccio paints a fresco. He personifies the innovative spirit of the early 15th century Florentines by painting in this one-point perspective that is very progressive. His original name was Tommaso di Ser Giovanni, and he learns under Masolino da Panico, who worked for in the International Gothic style that we talked about in the Proto-Renaissance. The International Gothic style is the one that's very unhumanistic with lots of gold leafing. He was a key in the establishment of the humanistic style, and he did that through realistic, human-like facial expressions and utilizing one-point perspective. He only lives for 27 years, though. So this is Masaccio's Trinity with the Virgin, St. John, the Evangelist, and the donors. It's in the Church of Santa Maria Novella in Florence, and he did it in 1425. You can see the full painting on the left and on the right, a labeling of who the different people will be or are in the storyline. So in the fresco, all of the vanishing points go to a point that centers where Jesus is hung on the cross. You see Jesus hung on the cross with God the Father standing behind the cross. The Holy Spirit is right above Jesus's head in the form of a dove. And then Mary sits on the left and St. John sits on the right. The people in the red coat and the blue cloak that sit in front of the scene are the donors. At the bottom, we see something called a memento mori. The inscription says, "What you are, I once was what I am, you will be." It's part of the Italian way of presenting something for the viewer to focus on when they kneel down to pray, but also reminding the viewer that they too at one point will die. Here is the memento mori detail of the fresco. We have some interesting application of mathematics in the execution of the space. Masaccio uses the rule of thirds, which is supposed to be more naturally pleasing to the eye than any other type of design. He also uses some classical elements from antiquity. So in the barrel vault, you see these squares on the ceiling. Those squares are called coffers. They were used by Hadrian when he built the Pantheon. The barrel vault is a classical antiquity design option. And then, of course, the engaged columns, the columns that are half columns on the right and the left, and then the full columns with the Ionic and Corinthian leaves. The scene is reminiscent of a Roman triumphal arch, and here God presents his son to the worshiper, as if the son is a complete human being. Masaccio's fresco is the very first to depict one-point perspective. Here's a detail of the donor portraits. They're the red person here and the blue person here, who are kneeling at the sides of the holy scene to well, I suppose they're kneeling beside the scene as a pious dedication. They were included because they are the ones who paid for the fresco to be done. And we know that donor portraits are common at this point. This is another of Masaccio's paintings. It is the expulsion of Adam and Eve from paradise. It's in the Brancacci Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence. Masaccio painted this particular painting at the end of his career, and throughout most of his career, he diligently studied the human figure. He studied the muscle structure, he studied the muscle structure of the face, and you can clearly see the fruit of his studies in the fresco painting that's before you. The facial expressions of the subject, of Adam and Eve, are full of anguish, and they make Adam and Eve very human. Adam and Eve have made a mistake, and that mistake cost them dearly, and you can see the anguish on their face of being expelled from the Garden of Eden. Masaccio is a master at modeling. Modeling is a term that we use to describe how the flesh turns in the light. Masaccio uses his knowledge of how the flesh turns in the light to create the representation of a light source. You can see the light coming from behind the angel angled at the back of the subjects. Adam and Eve become aware instantly that they are nude as they are expelled. If we look closely at the painting, you can see the giornata around Adam and the giornata that's created when Masaccio paints Eve and the background around her. Masaccio worked very quickly when he painted in fresco painting. He worked so quickly that the giornata is actually somewhat difficult to see. In most artists' frescoes, it's easy to see the giornata, but here Masaccio was such a master that he tried very hard to work quickly and to work very precisely. And so you get these beautiful images that are very emotional, very anatomically correct, and don't look as limited in the use of the fresco medium. This is another one of Masaccio's paintings from the Brancacci Chapel. It's his tribute money fresco. The art historian Vasari wrote that Masaccio's heroic style captures moments of majestic tension, developing a realistic approach to space and light. He brought about a human development in his work. Vasari highlights on the fact that Masaccio is able to bring humanism to a new level through his fresco painting. No other artist has been able to depict the fresco in this realistic of a manner, in this humanistic of a manner. Masaccio's accomplishments in this painting are vast in terms of being influential in the painting style of the Renaissance masters. Eventually, most Renaissance masters choose to work in oil, but Masaccio is still working in fresco because that's what's being commissioned from him. For one thing, he is able to create perspective. He has developed one-point perspective within the fresco. We looked at that in his Holy Trinity piece. He's using it again here in the tribute money. Jesus stands directly in the center of the painting, and that's where the one-point perspective converges at. Jesus stands in the center, and everybody turns to look at him and talk to him as he's telling the story of the tax collector. The tax collector has come to the group of men and is trying to collect their taxes, and they don't have the money to pay. And so Jesus instructs them to go over to the river and take a gold coin out of the fish and pay the tax collector. Masaccio accomplishes a very realistic fresco by grouping the people together in groups that are similar to the way we naturally stand in conversation. As well as you can see that the tax collector that's off to the side is discussing a side matter with one of the people. He utilizes the very first single light source in a fresco. Well, that's not true. Giotto used the first single light source in a fresco, but we haven't seen it since Giotto did it. And so now Masaccio is standing on the shoulders of Giotto and adding his own interpretation. Masaccio uses a single light source that helps to create shadows on the ground from where the people stand and the light casts a shadow. You can notice it here at their feet. Also, the gestures that are used in the grouping of the people are very realistic. They're not overly gestural and overly emotional. They're very much the way we look when we talk in conversation. He also is able to vary the way the light and color fades as it recedes into space and gets further away from us. So the pink in the shirt that Jesus wears is more saturated than, say, the pink that the person wears that's behind Jesus. The red that's at the front of the piece on the back of the tax collector is much more vibrant than the one in the background of the man that stands here. He also utilizes a throwback to the classical Roman ideals by including the barrel arch, the Roman columns, and of course the Roman dress. In this slide, I'm asking you to compare Masaccios' tribute money to Giotto's Lamentation. I wanted to tell you a little bit about Masaccios' career in terms of his schooling. He studied with a master who was actually a court painter, and of course the courts favored the International Gothic style, and so the guy that he studied with worked in the International Gothic style. At some point, though, we feel that he surpassed his teacher's skill. He was a descendant of Giotto in terms of artistic relevance and artistic influence. He was highly influenced by Giotto. But his main focus was taking that International Gothic style and making it more humanistic. This double portrait by Pier della Francesca is a portrait that is typical of the early Renaissance style in Italy. You can see that the side profile is the norm here. This opposes the early Northern Renaissance portraits that were popularized by Van Eyck in the three-quarter profile style. From about the 1440s on, Italian portraiture is in profile view. It's really a way of setting up a status symbol of the individual. The people that you see here are the Duke and Duchess. Well, I don't know what they're the Duke and Duchess of, but they are a Duke and Duchess. These portraits were done in oil, and this is a first for the Italians. If you remember right, oils were not an Italian idea. They were a Northern European idea. Van Eyck popularized them. Oil paint and the printing press come to Italy and influence the spread of printmaking in Italy. And in the 1480s, this changes and we begin to see a frontal view in terms of portraiture. But now, from about the 1440s to 1480s, we see that the side profile is the norm. These portraits were the Duchess and Duke of Urbino. The Duchess dies in childbirth with their 9th child, and the Duke is so upset that he commissions the portraits to remember her by. The portraits were displayed in their home, facing each other. And you can see the luminous quality that the portraiture has due to the pink rosy tones in their face that shine through the skin tones. The Italians love landscapes, and so, of course, behind their portraits we see an Italian landscape, which is another hallmark of Italian portraiture. This is the Ducal Palace in Mantua by Andrea Mantegna. Right here, what you're seeing is the bedroom of the prince. His name is the Gonzaga, and then the ceiling of the bedroom is an illusionistic fresco. The room that you see in front of you is the bedroom of the prince from Mantegna. We see that the frescoes are propaganda because they advertise the prince's power in terms of their opulence and their richness. We see images of courtly life. In the images we see the ducal palace itself. Gonzaga's bedroom is actually where they would have entertained guests, which I know seems a little odd because we just don't do that in our bedrooms today. But in the 1400s in Italy, that's the way it was. Some of the walls that you see in front of you are painted with a leathery finish to them. And some of the walls look like the leather hangs and have been pulled aside like a curtain to reveal the world behind the curtain. It shows the Gonzaga family as if they had all their life lived in the court, that they really didn't know anything other than that. There are royal courts, pages delivering news, children, a court dwarf, a dog that is watching you, and you are a stranger in the interaction between you and the painting. We see everyday life that takes place in the room while you stand there. The other work of art that you see is the ceiling fresco, or the detail of the ceiling fresco. And it was really highly innovative for the time. It's called pictorial illusionism, or an illusionistic fresco. It has some trompe l'oeil, just like we talked about with Van Eyck. The oculus that is painted, which is that big round opening, we say is descito in su. It's Italian for meaning from below upward. The vertical perspective comes to the viewer from below, and the viewer is looking at the painting upwards. So you're standing on the floor looking upwards. It's a unified perspective space. And one of the angels holds on to an apple that he looks as if he's going to drop it on your head. Let's see, you see women of the court. There's a basket with a stick on it. Well, actually the basket sits on a stick. And there's an angel peeing so high up that he pees on you, per se. In the Camera Picta, Mantegna performs really triumphant feat by producing the first completely consistent illusionistic fresco. He does this by integrating real and painted architectural elements. This is a daring experiment which leads him to complete the room's decoration with the first perspective of a ceiling seen from below. Inside the Camera Picta, the viewer becomes the viewed as the figures look down into the room from the painted oculus. You can see the cloud-filled blue sky with several putti or cupids. There's a strong sense of foreshortening here, and it sets an amorous mood for the room for the newlyweds. There are two spectators who smile down at the newlyweds.
Hmm.
And we don't know who they are, they're just unknown spectators. There's a prominent peacock, which is an attribute of Juno, Jupiter's bride, who oversees lawful marriages. This is really the height of perfectionism when it comes to illusionistic fresco. We won't see illusionistic fresco like this again until we look at the Baroque. This is Palaiologos, Hercules, and Antaeus. It's made of bronze, and it's about 18 inches from the base, so it's a little less than 2 feet tall. And it's in the Museo Nacional del Bargello in Florence. This little sculpture is the perfect sculpture in the round. It's made of bronze, and it's just pleasing from every single angle. We are presented with the exact moment that Hercules defeats Antaeus, and Hercules realizes the only way he can die is if he's not touching the ground. Thus, he lifts Antaeus and quite literally squeezes the life out of him. Palaiologos was one of the first artists that we know that was extremely interested in the human anatomy. He was even known to have dissected cadavers, which at that time was not common. He was also very interested in mythology, and so he depicted lots of mythological events in his art, as opposed to religious events. This is an example of a return to the classical subject matter that we saw prevalent in the early Renaissance. It was commissioned for the Medici family, and it sat in the Medici's private home sculpture collection. This is Palaiologos, The Battle of the Ten Nudes. It's from the Cincinnati Art Museum in Ohio, so if you have time to go to the Cincinnati Museum of Art, you would find this particular work. This is really an advertisement of Palaiologos' skills. There's a new invention in the Northern Renaissance. It's the printing press. And so Palaiologos feels that he can master the human figure because he has this obsession with the human form, in which he spends a lot of time dissecting cadavers in order to understand the musculature and the anatomy of the particular of the body. He's really the first artist that successfully shows the human figure in this dynamic process. And because of it, he sets the bar higher for realism in art. In this particular work, the only surviving character is in the upper left-hand corner, next to the sign that dons Palaiologos' name. This particular piece is one of the most important early Renaissance pieces because it's an advertisement of the skills that he had, but also because it tells us that artists were branching out and trying to get employment in lots of ways possible. This is a testament of trade flourishing as well. Why? Because it's an engraving. It's an engraving, and that means that they're using the printing press in order to promote their work. And for Palaiologos, he could print these, hand them out to show what his skills were. This is Sandro Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, done in 1484 to 1486. It's tempera and gold on canvas. It's fairly large. It's almost 6 feet by 9 feet. And it's in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. In fact, I've seen it. It's quite remarkable because you don't realize how technical the tempera painting gets until you see one that's this size up close. You really can see every strand, every line that the paintbrush picks up and puts on the canvas. It's very different than oil. Botticelli is painting in the classic neoclassical style, meaning this is a complete throwback painting from the classic times of the Roman Republic. He chooses a mythological subject matter. He's painting the birth of Aphrodite, who is a product of Zeus and Athena's pairing. I'm not exactly sure the myth behind the story. I'm asking you to look this particular work up in your textbook and read it. I can tell you a little bit about it, but to really understand the story behind the painting, you need to go to the textbook. You can see the classical style showing up very clearly here in this work of art. Aphrodite rides on this clamshell that she was born from the sea and delivered to the seashore. The personification of spring stands at her right and shields her nude body with this beautiful persimmon colored fabric. On the left, you have the personification of wind that has carried the seashell or the clamshell to the shore with Aphrodite in it. The texture of the waves is created by this linear treatment of the water, this squiggly line in a shell shape. And the wind has wings, like the wings of a bird of prey, and he carries this strong movement in his body, especially you can see it in the fabric that the wind is blowing towards the personification of spring.